USG, she cracked some boom with gravity. Go me, bully boy, so huh. The carrion comes to save our souls and take us home. One day when the fixing is done, we'll take our leave and go.
The original Dead Space was one of my personal favourite survival horror games when it released back in 2008, and if you've seen my video on that game, you'll know I was pretty skeptical about the newly released remake. Dead Space still holds up incredibly well, and the technological gap between 2008 and today appears wildly indifferent compared to video game evolution with, say, the Resident Evil 1 to 3 in the 90s and their respective remakes. Now, having finished the Dead Space remake, I was a damn fool to ever doubt the need for this game, because Dead Space has been re-engineered from the ground up as a faithful recreation of the original game whilst modernising it in a number of ways, many of which elevate this version above the original, making it the definitive way to play Dead Space. Yet, does that mean I can recommend it to everyone, both newcomers and fans of the original game? Now, I've spoken about my thoughts on Dead Space in depth in general before on the channel, so if you haven't already, make sure you check out that video. Here for this review, I am going to focus solely on its new features and how they do or do not improve upon the original and the core concept of the game, and whether or not they have enough impact to ultimately justify the £70 price tag of this thing. Firstly, let's get the obvious one out of the way, the graphics. I don't know about you guys, but whenever I think back to an old game, I remember the graphics being far superior than they ever were, because at the time you think, how could they ever get any better than this? And here with Dead Space, this is how I remember the game looking back on my PlayStation 3 15 years ago. It wasn't until I really compared my footage between the two versions to see how far we have really come from a graphical perspective. This game looks great in its haunting portrayal of a derelict planet-cracking ship in the isolated void of space. Taking inspiration from the industrial design of the Nostromo from the movie Alien, or the body horror aesthetic from Event Horizon and The Thing, the USG Ishimura is again a wonderfully terrifying setting with astounding atmosphere thanks to the environmental effects. The environments, character models and textures are fine, but honestly they would be pretty standard if it weren't for the lighting, smoke and particle effects that give this game a whole new look. The sprawling vistas offer both impossibly breathtaking moments with its scale and depth, or right down to the sense of claustrophobia and isolation in the tight, dark corridors lit only by sparks and flickering lights. It's a significant upgrade that the visuals alone help to amplify the experience for the modern hardware, but honestly, this was expected and you can see this. Unlike previous remakes in the genre, notably the impressive Resident Evil 2 remake, at first glance, Dead Space may seem like nothing more than a graphical upgrade, but there is far more to this game than meets the eye. It is the more discreet, subtle but deep changes that make Dead Space an example of a remake done right. And the core foundations are intact due to the game design of the original still being very playable today. But it is clear the new developers at EA Motive aimed to capture what made the game so terrifying in 2008 by not just giving the game a boob job, but enhancing the survival horror experience with tweaks and in some cases entirely new gameplay features that truly do inject horror into a game many of us have essentially played before. And that was my biggest fear going into Dead Space. The lack of fear due to my existing knowledge of the title, but those worries were very soon put to rest. This time around, the Ishimura is one big interconnected map. All areas accessible through connecting corridors and elevators in which you can walk from one end of the ship to the other if you so wish, once you have progressed enough through the story and have unlocked the paths, including a number of shortcuts that give you those moments of, oh, I know where I am. This all really helps in giving the ship a sense of authenticity. Unlike the original, where the game was broken up into sections of the ship through chapters, accessible by taking a tram from one place to another, this did make different levels feel disconnected from one another. Here, the tram acts simply as a method of fast travel that is entirely optional. The number of locations, the bridge, medical bay, hydroponics, crew quarters, feel more naturally placed within this abandoned behemoth as opposed to feeling like different levels, separated by loading screens and only explorable in the levels they were intended. I absolutely love this new design and it makes for a more believable, lived-in environment, one that seems like it is smaller in scale in a way, but it is tightly packed. Most of the locations have been recreated room by room with a few additional secrets and corridors, yet despite it being a faithful recreation, everything just makes more sense in the architecture of the ship. In the original I kind of thought, well, how do all these areas fit within this comparatively small ship when looking in from the outside? Here, by making everything so connected and free for player exploration, it actually makes sense. All laid around the one tram line for the workers to commute from their quarters to their workstations and mess halls, it's far more plausible in its design, which in turn makes for far more immersive and credible level design. With this new, expansive way of exploring the Ishimura, the developers had to find some reason for the player to backtrack, explore, and not give in to the efficiency of fast travel, but instead want to make their way around the ship multiple times, without it ever becoming stale. Why make this sandbox if there is little point to play around in it? And this is, for the most part, done well. With that, let's start with the story. The story of Dead Space is primarily unchanged. Engineer Isaac Clarke and his crew aboard the USG Ishimura, a planet-cracking ship whose communications have gone down as we respond to their distress call. Aboard the ship is Nicole Brennan.
I can't believe you're here.
I thought I'd never see you again.
Isaac's love interest, injecting some personal investment into the mission as we board the ship to find it has been overrun by creatures referred to as necromorphs, created by a mysterious artifact called the Marker that seems to be worshipped by an elusive cult known as the Church of Utology. A third-person survival horror action game, players take control of Isaac as we make our way through the ship, leaving a trail of bloody limbs as we dismember the mutated crew, completing objectives of fixing various parts of the ship, finding survivors, uncovering the mystery, with the goal of getting home, own limbs intact. There are no alternative universe twist-ups resulting in a change of direction for the series. Those who have played Dead Space multiple times or just know the story well may struggle to find reason to revisit this game from a narrative perspective, as this is pretty much a beat-for-beat retelling, yet the narrative is expanded upon in interesting ways, similar to, say, that of a good director's cut of a movie. Scenes like the introduction of the Infectors and first meeting Dr. Mercer is way more engaging as you are held helplessly by stasis, adding a welcome cinematic flair to iconic moments. Additional lore through audio tapes, crew logs, and with the inclusion of side quests, core characters' backstories have more depth than them before, allowing us to explore the motivation of characters and events leading up to Isaac's arrival on the ship. The side quests themselves do not add any real gameplay value, consisting in some pretty mundane tasks such as collecting a number of rigs from dead crew members to increase the access of a new access card system, more on that soon, or following a straight path from one room to another viewing holographic video logs of previously recorded conversations. But it is the content of said tasks which leads to revelations of Isaac and Nicole's relationship, Isaac's family's past and their connections to the Church of Unitology, and Nicole's mission to expose their sinister truths. So I found they do add a layer of intrigue to the narrative that interlinks into kind of future lore that, as a fan of the series, I enjoyed this newfound knowledge in the expanded upon plot, despite already knowing how the story goes, which is essential for returning players of the original game, as I would say no more than 10% of this game is new. Now, a huge departure from the original in that 10% is the fact Isaac speaks this time around. Previously being a silent protagonist, all of the conversations were one-sided and Isaac quickly became ordered around by his co-workers, making everything feel like a fetch quest for others, a complaint of mine in the original game. Here, being voiced by Gunnar Wright, the original voice actor from Dead Space 2 and 3, Isaac has personality and input into the story.
Oh god, that smell. What have you got, Isaac?
Shit. It's not just comms or the guidance system. Half the Ishimura's in the red. Engines, hull, the trams.
Could do that kind of damage to a planet cracker.
Now, by giving Isaac a voice doesn't change the story or the player objectives themselves, but it certainly helps in giving it all meaning. Isaac interacting with Nicole, offering his own suggestions on how to fix the abundance of technical problems on a ship as an engineer, because that is his job, and no one else's, to know what is wrong with a spaceship engine. It's appeared in the original, everyone was more of an engineer than he was, and he was just the wrench. Isaac is smart, knows how to handle himself and the situation, and thank God he does this without trying to balance the horror with humour or smart-ass quips. The last thing Dead Space needed was an overconfident, cheesy action hero in the style of Nathan Drake in space. Not that there's anything wrong with that, and I would actually quite like to see that, but there is a time and a game for it. It could have been an easy mistake to make on the developer's part, especially as this is quickly becoming the norm, but Isaac only speaks when spoken to here and to progress the plot. No witty dialogue like telling a necromorph to break a leg right before separating shins from thighs with a plasma cutter. It's honestly perfectly balanced, still allowing the player to reflect themselves onto a silent character and roaming the ship for almost entire chapters, whilst adding that character personality when the time is right. And this doesn't mean Isaac is completely silent when snapping arms and shooting babies though, thanks to the game's quite brilliant Alive system. An acronym for Adrenaline, Limbic Response System, Intelligent Dialogue, Vitals, Exertions. What does this mean? Simply put, Isaac feels like a living, breathing human on the verge of shedding bricks in his hot and sweaty protective suit. His heartbeat increases following a jump scare or when his health is low. He gets out of breath following a sprint or an action-heavy sequence. It may seem quite minor in theory, but it adds an incredible amount of immersion. The subtlety of the heartbeat as it quickly thuds to then slow down as you enter a safe space following a sighting of a necromorph in the distance. It reflects that fear onto the player in a very creative way, one that was far more successful than I thought it would be. None of this appears scripted either, as it is impacted by both the player's skill in how much health you have and your ability to fight the necros, but also the game's new procedurally generated nature. Do not take that the wrong way. This is a linear experience that will not change each time. This isn't a roguelike or anything like that, but item placement is randomized, or at least which items themselves are in the item assigned locations. Meaning the next 10 lockers or crates smashed may contain useful loot like health items and ammo for your favourite elbow-crushing weapon, or nothing but credits to buy new suit upgrades and the aforementioned items at a store. In addition to this, enemy placement is also random in certain scenarios. One time, walking through a corridor may be completely safe, whereas the next you may prolapse as a necromorph comes crashing through a vent you have walked past half a dozen times. This does give the game an unpredictable nature, even when you are completing those previously mentioned side quests that require the player to revisit explored areas, or even in death when you're just making your way back to where you were before, the path may not hold the same encounters as they did the first time. This is a great addition to the game design, one that would actually be sorely missed had it not been included in the game, especially with those side quests. And to be honest, I do wish the game was a little more like it. The random encounters did admittedly seem quite sporadic at times, and it was hard to tell if this design was only applicable in certain areas of the ship, or I was just lucky when I would not run into something for a long time. Particularly when going back to unlock higher security rooms to grab some valuable loot, nothing would happen, but knowing it could still added some trepidation as I wandered around. That is amplified by the consistent atmosphere. More so to the randomly generated nature of the game, new features allow the player to have some input themselves in how the exploration plays out, in some few cases anyway. More puzzles have been added to the game where I had to reroute some power to a door or mechanism, and in doing so I had to decide whether to sacrifice light or oxygen, choosing between not being able to see my surroundings or a time limit before I suffocated if I couldn't make it to an oxygen supply in time. This is something many of us knew would be included in the game, and it was probably what I was most excited about. However, I would say this is the most disappointing new feature of Dead Space, as I could count on one hand the number of times I actually had to do this, with those times usually being in an isolated room or a small area. They were over very quickly and few and far between to make any real impact on me outside the first time it happened. Pretty disappointing that they didn't implement this further in larger portions of the game. But going from one disappointment to an absolute pleasure is the reconfigured weapons upgrade system. Weapon upgrades in the original game were honestly absolutely terrible in the way they were handled. Retaining the use of nodes here to upgrade weapon statistics like rate of fire, range, damage output and ammo capacity, every single upgrade this time matters. I hated in the original many nodes felt wasted as each upgrade would have blank spaces between them that had to be unlocked before something meaningful. Further to this, the game tried to include a risk-reward element where nodes would also be used to unlock rooms. Here, there are no blank spaces, meaning that every unlock is significant, always progressing your arsenal at a more effective pace. Secret rooms no longer require nodes to unlock them, but instead clearance level obtained through collecting new rigs. There are 4 clearance tiers, each progressing tier allowing you to collect more loot and weapon upgrade schematics to further develop your weapons. These upgrades include buffs for each weapon. For instance, the plasma cutter will burn enemies, not only cutting off their limbs but setting them ablaze, offering out more damage. Shooting limbs with the weapons also feels more satisfying than ever before due to the limbs having layers like an onion. Layers of flesh slowly disintegrating right down to the bone before the final blow. And playing on hard mode means enemies can take more hits before being downed. However, this only adds to the gratuitous violence as you slowly see those legs and arms peel away before they are dismembered. It is so satisfying, and this is the only way they could have really made it more satisfying than the original, by making it more disgusting than ever before. And I just love using the stasis to pick up those detached limbs to then impale someone into a wall. Speaking of which, there's even environmental attacks now where you can literally pull off pipes from the wall to then throw them across the room to impale something into a wall.
Hazardous anomaly detected. Quarantine activated.
Very cool. Every weapon now has a unique secondary fire mode, allowing the player to get more creative with their killing tactics. In the original, I found I only used a certain few weapons, primarily the line gun, which was way overpowered. However, now in the remake, that weapon itself seems to have been nerfed, and every single weapon felt incredibly useful. I never used a flamethrower in the original as it wasn't as effective as everything else. Here though, use the secondary fire mode and this will ignite a huge wall of fire, holding back swarms of necromorphs as you tear them apart. The pulse rifle fires an explosive mine, the line gun a burning laser beam that can be attached to objects and waved around with stasis. Every weapon in their respective firing modes adds so much more room for experimentation to the action that I never settled for one weapon. I wanted to switch up constantly and see what I could do next. Smarter enemy AI also called for carefully choosing the right weapons for each encounter, and the secondary fire modes helped in taking down some of the more difficult enemies. The stasis infused necromorph, for instance, hard as my junk when trying to hit one tiny sweet spot to slow them down. Having trouble? Just fire a mine in their general direction. That'll do the job. Speaking of getting the job done, certain objectives have been tweaked from a gameplay perspective to make the game far less frustrating at times. Like sitting in a turret blasting away asteroids. This is still here, but instead the mission is far more interesting, having to go outside of the ship to reprogram the auto-firing cannons whilst dodging the asteroids. It's far more interesting and a whole less a pain in the butt. But is it all more content and worth the price of admission? I really like Dead Space, and I like this remake even more. It's made with passion and has been improved in all the right ways, even though I do feel some of those ways could have gone a little further, like the procedurally generated nature of it, and more moments of player choice in that exploration. If you have never played Dead Space before, then this is absolutely the way you should experience the game first time if you're wondering where to start, and honestly, I envy you if you are going into this with little to no knowledge. This is a strong recommendation from me. Now, if you've played Dead Space before, then this is a great throwback to a great game from 2008 that has been made for the fans just as much as the uninitiated. But you cannot expect for this to feel like a new game. Going in expecting this to be a remake in the same caliber of, say, Resident Evil 2 or Final Fantasy 7, you will be left feeling pretty deflated. This is the same Dead Space you remember, nothing less and a little bit more. But for me, that is not a criticism. Having played the original again almost a year ago now, I didn't find this game repetitive or uninteresting at all, because it takes a great survival horror game and makes it better. And isn't that really all we wanted? I'd say so, and we got it. And it's a shame that in about a month's time, history will probably repeat itself as Dead Space will be living in the shadow once again of Resident Evil 4 when that remake comes out, which looks friggin' incredible. Stay tuned for that. What do you think of the Dead Space remake? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Let me know in the comments below. Give the video a thumbs up if you liked it. Give it a thumbs down if you didn't. Subscribe to the channel to catch all my upcoming videos. Thanks for tuning in and see you on the next one. Bye bye.